versions of data flow. There was something called as data flow Gen 1. There was data flow Gen 2 without CI/CD property enabled. And then there was data flow Gen 2 with CI/CD. Now, if you see data flow Gen 1, Gen 2 without CI/CD and data flow Gen 2 with CI/CD, correct? If you check the corresponding Git integration status, data flow Gen 1 and data flow Gen 2 without Git integration, meaning the earlier versions of data flow Gen 2 or data flow Gen 2 created with that Git enabled property, do not support Git integration. Those are unsupported. Hence, you have an option to export the JSON for those corresponding data flows as part of preserving your code externally and manually. But in case of data flow Gen 2 CI/CD, you can sync it. Uncommitted meaning I have made some changes, but I'm yet to synchronize within my Git repository. So it is supported. And hence you do not get an option of export the JSON because it's directly integrated. The underlying code is directly integrated within our Git repository. Correct? Now, whenever we create any data flow, some additional components gets created within the workspace that is not directly visible to the users in the workspace URL or in the workspace UI. What do I mean by that? Correct? I'll explain that in a couple of minutes. Correct? But now, this was one of the difference between data flow Gen 1 and Gen 2, wherein data flow Gen 2 with CI/CD enabled supports Git integration, whereas data flow Gen 1 and data flow Gen 2 without Git CI/CD is not supported for Git integration. Remember these aspects because these are critical with respect to your DP 700 examination. Difference between data flow Gen 1 and data flow Gen 2. Now, under my data pipeline, we have the data flow activity. Within data flow activity, we can trigger all types of data flows, be it data flow Gen 1, be it data flow Gen 2 without CI/CD and with CI/CD. Correct? Let's take a look. So if you see here, I have data flow Gen 1 with name df underscore Gen 1 underscore DC. df underscore Gen 1 underscore DC. But unfortunately, yesterday, because of that confusion, that there was a confusion, there is a bug wherein in the drop down, it is providing it as data flow Gen 2. That is what led to yesterday's confusion. Ideally, this is a data flow Gen 1, but that's a bug at Microsoft side wherein they have popped it up under data flow Gen 2 itself, rather than creating another category of data flow Gen 1. So, data flow Gen 1, data flow Gen 2 without CI/CD, as the name suggests, I have created a data flow Gen 2 without CI/CD with the name underscore without. And all data flow Gen 2 can be triggered via data pipeline. So all types of data flows, be it Gen 1, Gen 2 with CI/CD and without CI/CD, can be triggered via the data flow activity within the data pipelines. Now, we also saw what is the copy job activity. Copy job is similar to, one can say that is similar to the copy activity, but copy activity can be parameterized, can be made dynamic, unlike copy job, which is an hard-coded version. And it is a fast way of copying the data, which provides us full data copy and incremental data copy. Now, up till now, whatever we had seen with respect to the copy activity or the data flow, those were hard-coded versions of the sources and sink, meaning I had not parameterized them. Correct. Yesterday, when we had taken a look with respect to Dataflow Gen 2, we had seen that we can parameterize, we can create parameters within the Dataflow Gen 2. Correct. Now, let's take a look with respect to how we can parameterize the source and the sink within the Dataflow Gen 2 and how we can better make use of that. So let me create new data flow with required parameter. So now the first step for me is to get the data. Correct. Now under get data, under OneLake catalog. Correct. Now under OneLake catalog, if I order this by the location, can you see there is a delete trial capacity, which is my current workspace. Correct. Under delete trial capacity, I am seeing something called as a lakehouse and a warehouse with the name staging lakehouse for data flows, staging warehouse for data flows. Correct. Now, let me go to that workspace. Delete trial capacity. Correct. Let me sort it by type. Now, if you see under warehouse, I see there are only 3 warehouse: destination warehouse, CI underscore warehouse, case insensitive underscore warehouse, AZ copy underscore AZ copy warehouse. Correct. Anywhere am I seeing this staging warehouse for data flows underscore something something and staging lakehouse for data flows underscore something something? No. Correct. It is because to improve the performance and reliability, the Dataflow Gen 2 uses staging items to store the intermediate data during the data transformation. Now, the staging artifacts are basically your intermediate data storage locations used by Dataflow Gen 2. And these artifacts are the staging data flow and staging lakehouse and data flow staging warehouse. And these staging objects are created automatically when you create your first data flow and are managed by Dataflow Gen 2. And as we saw, these artifacts are hidden from the user in the workspace experience, meaning I cannot see them in the workspace, but are visible in some other experiences like get data or similar to how we had seen the Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer. Correct. There is something called as Lakehouse Explorer as well. There you would be able to see. It is ideally recommended not to access or modify the data or upload any data or make any changes in the staging artifacts, because these artifacts are not designed for the direct access for the users. Hence, those have been disabled from the workspace experience for us. What Dataflow Gen 2 is, it manages the data in the staging artifacts and ensures that the data is in a consistent state across every usage. Now, accessing the data within the staging artifacts is directly isn't supported, because at what time, how Microsoft has created that staging aspect, how is it processing, that is not known. Hence, we cannot say that the data that we are accessing from here can be in a consistent state or not. Now, when you delete the workspace, automatically the staging artifacts associated with the workspace automatically gets removed. Now, one can even disable the staging in the data flow and refresh. Then automatically the data gets cleaned up. Or you delete the data flow and the data associated with that data flow is directly removed within the staging layer. But imagine there are multiple data flows. Multiple data flow does not include multiple staging artifacts. There is one staging artifact per workspace, and the data corresponding to that corresponding data flow would get deleted once that corresponding data flow gets deleted. Any queries up till now on the concept of staging? So for better performance and better management and transformation of the data, Dataflow Gen 2 uses an intermittent staging layer, which is this lakehouse and the warehouse. Any queries?
So, no practical issues, right?
Sorry?
In real, no practical issues, right, of data flow staging?
No, meaning we are not supposed to access it. It's of no use directly for us, and we should not use it directly,
Okay.
ideally. Clear?
Yeah.
It's for intermittent processing that Microsoft uses a staging layer. Now, let's understand the parameterization aspect. Correct? Before parameterization aspect, let me create a parameter. Correct? Let's say the parameter name is lakehouse table. Correct? For now, I am marking it as not required. Correct? Type as text value. I can provide it as, let's say, not required table. So I have created a parameter and that is not required. Now, let me get the data. Let's go to our common aspect, which is the Azure SQL database. Now in the Azure SQL database, I can parameterize the server name as well. Can you see? I can add a parameter and I can drop down which parameter value I want. Rather than hard coding this connection detail, I can parameterize the connection at runtime. But for now, for the source, I'll hard code it. It states that there is already an existing connection similar to what we had taken a look yesterday. Since the database is becoming active, let's wait for a couple of minutes. Parallelly, let me duplicate certain tabs. So we saw that I can parameterize the source connection details. Now, let me copy this data into a destination. Now, if you see the destination, I want it to be a lake house. And I want it to be a lake house within the delete trial capacity. Now, when I expand this, can you all see during that time also I'm able to see the staging layer. Data flow staging lakehouse for data flows, and the corresponding warehouse. So these are intermittent staging layers that Microsoft creates with respect to Dataflow Gen 2. Now I want this data, this table data to be copied into the lakehouse one, and I want the table name to be parameterized. Correct. I want it to select the automatic mappings and I want to save the settings. Now I want to save and run this pipeline. Sorry, the Dataflow Gen 2. So I can see a message that refresh has started. Now let me take a look with respect to that log. And parallelly, let me open the lakehouse. It was lakehouse 1. And it was a new data flow that I created, correct? New data flow. Let me check its recent runs. It is in progress, correct? And let me refresh here. Can you see the table name that I had parameterized got created on a dynamic basis, not required table, correct? This was the data that got copied into the lakehouse as a table, the dynamic parameterization. Any queries up till now? Yes or no?
No.
Now, I can see that it has succeeded, correct? Now, let's tweak a little on this, correct? When I say tweak a little, let me update this parameter, correct? Manage parameters, edit parameters. Okay. Now, rather than lakehouse table being a not required entity, I want it to be required, correct? And now let me click on OK. Now let me click on save and run. I have not made any change other than making the parameter as not required, as required, correct? Now, let me go and check the runs. It has started. It would execute for a couple of minutes. Let's wait for a couple of minutes. Now, what does that not required and required parameter signify? Correct? That we'll understand in a couple of minutes. In the earlier scenario, when I had made it not required, it took the default value that I had provided in the initial instance itself. Correct? So hence, at that time, it created the table with the same name. Correct? Now also I have made it as required, but did I pass any parameter value to it? No, correct, because this was a manual way of triggering it. So now in case if I go and trigger this manually now, that is, let me delete this table here. Now, in case if I go ahead and trigger this manually now, it is stating that refresh has started. Correct. Now let me go and check. I can even cancel the refresh in between if I want it. The property which was not available earlier. So now it's basically executing the data flow Gen 2. And in case if I see my lake house, I can see that the table got created. So was there any significance of me making the parameter as required from not required? There was no change. Correct? So then what is the significance of that property? That becomes important in case of when you are triggering it via external way rather than manual way, meaning via data pipeline or something. Correct. So for that, let me go ahead and create a data pipeline. DF. So within the data pipeline now, I want to trigger the data flow. Correct. Now, as I had stated, correct, I can even parameterize. Up till now, we have taken a hard-coded version of everything. Correct. Let me parameterize this. Let me make a dynamic content. Correct. But that I'll do after I explain the concept of data flows. So within this, I want new data flow with required parameter. Now, if you see, I had created a parameter here within the data flow that is visible here. Correct. But am I getting any option here of parameters? I selected this drop down, but nowhere am I getting any parameters. But can you see, I have selected another data flow, but here I'm able to see something called as data flow parameters as the drop down. But here, even if I have created a data flow with parameter, I'm not getting that option. Let's understand why and what. But before that, let me execute this. Let me delete this table again, because this acts as a reference whether our pipeline is getting executed properly or not. Now let me go ahead and execute this pipeline. This pipeline is now internally going and calling the data flow gen 2 and executing the data flow gen 2. That I can take a look by checking the recent runs. If you see, it is in progress, 8:32 a.m. IST. So it's in progress. But the question begs to differ is, I have created the parameter, but why am I not able to actually provide parameters to this at the runtime? And if that is the case, then what is that required and not required property within the parameter signifies? Correct? If you see, the new table got created, not required table. Correct? Now, the pipeline got executed, the data flow gen 2 got executed. The reason for everything is there is an options wherein you can define how your data flow gen 2 and everything needs to be enabled. Correct? If you see, right click. If you right click on this, can you see this property enable staging? There are multiple properties. If you remember what I had said, data flow gen 2 creates those staging artifacts in between for better data transformation and managing. It is because when you create a data flow by default, that is enabled. But in case if you go ahead and disable this enable staging aspect, for the corresponding data transformation, it won't use the staging layer. It will directly process it. Now there is other aspects like incremental refresh. On what basis do I want to use incremental refresh? It states that it is not supported to set up on a query when the data destination is set to append or uses a dynamic schema. We had used the dynamic schema, correct? Hence, I cannot use the incremental aspects. But we can also disable the staging for the corresponding data flow gen. Entity, not entity by entity, it's defined. Now this options is where I can define how I want my column profiles and everything to be visible. Correct? Meaning, do I want to show white spaces and new line characters in the data view, or do I want to keep it as is, etc. Now within that, there are multiple different aspects, correct? Do I want to export the diagnostic? How do I want to detect the data? Which regional setting do I want? Do I want to always use fast connectors, or do I want to limit the number of concurrent evaluations? And there comes the next aspect called parameters. As of now, corresponding to this data flow Gen 2, this enable parameter to be discovered and overridden for execution is disabled. Hence, it is taking the default value that I had provided. And even if it was required, not required, it was not aspect because it was not discovered and I was not allowing it to be overridden during execution. So I have to enable this property. Now, once I enable this property, now once I click on save and run, correct, it is saying that the refresh started, correct. But now once I refresh this, let it run a little, correct. Now let me go ahead and select my data flow again. Can you see? For the same data flow, when I refresh the metadata, the data flow parameter got dropped down because I have ensured that now that becomes visible in the output aspect. But unfortunately, rather than directly providing the parameters that are associated with the data flow, I have to explicitly provide the parameter name and the corresponding value. And can you see here? The execution failed. And the execution failed because there was a problem missing argument for required parameter. What happened is, since I have made it as a required parameter and I have ensured that that parameter needs to be overridden in the manual way of trigger. When I trigger it manually now, correct? When I click on refresh now, am I getting any option to override the parameters? Or am I getting any pop-up with respect to pass the corresponding parameter value? No, correct. So because of that all the manual executions of the data flow Gen 2 with required parameter and that enable parameter property, sorry, the parameter visible property enabled, all the manual executions would fail. One cannot execute them manually from the portal. So in that case, one has to trigger it via REST API or via data pipeline itself. You cannot schedule it explicitly. You remember we could explicitly schedule the data flow as well, correct? So with the concept of required parameters and discover the parameter property enabled, one cannot explicitly schedule the data flow Gen 2 or one cannot explicitly manually refresh the data flow Gen 2. It has to be triggered via an external API aspect or via data pipeline. Now, let me pass the parameter here, lakehouse table. Can you see here the L and T are capital, but I have tweaked a bit and it is of type string. Let me pass a value 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C. Let's check whether this would get executed now or not. So what are your thoughts? Would the pipeline and the corresponding data flow gen to be successful or would it fail? It failed because there is no such parameter, correct? It is expecting a parameter of the name lakehouse table, which is required, and I have not passed the corresponding value to it. Hence, now let me tweak the here lake house table. Now, once I execute this, now the data flow gen 2 would get executed properly, and I'll be able to see a new table called ABC or something like that, whatever parameter value I have passed. So team, any queries on the concept of parameterization in Dataflow Gen 2? But with parameterization and the concept of required parameter, how the corresponding limitation sets in that one has to trigger it explicitly via data pipeline or REST API and override the parameter value or pass the parameter value in every execution, and one cannot manually go ahead and execute it. So any queries on the concept of till now? Now the data flow gen 2 got executed, and in case if I refresh it, I'll see something called as 123 ABC table name. Now let me tweak the parameter. Rather than making it as required, I'll make it as not required. Correct. Let me delete this table not required table. Now let me save and run this. Now in this case, would the data flow gen to be successful or would it fail again? Any thoughts?
It will run, I think.
Okay. So let's take its time. Parallelly, let's focus on. So up till now we have seen parameterization with respect to the data flow gen 2. Correct. Now let's understand how I can parameterize the data flow trigger as well. Correct. So for that, let me select another activity. Correct. Here, this is my workspace. Correct. Let me copy the workspace name. Let me create a parameter called workspace name, and let me select the default value as delete trial capacity. Correct. Here, now let me add a dynamic content. But before dynamic content, let me also select the data flow that I want to trigger. Correct. So here I want to select data flow gen 2 without. Let me copy the data flow name as well here. Correct. And parameterize it. df name. Now let me go ahead. Can you see it got succeeded? So it's only when that you have the parameter as required and you enable the visual appearance of that parameter, then the manual trigger limitation sets in. Now, with respect to the corresponding data flow, now let me parameterize it. So there is something called as and dynamic content, correct? In case if I select and dynamic content, I can then pass the corresponding value, workspace name. And now, since the workspace name is parameterized, it does not provide me the automatic drop down of the names, correct? So let me provide the data flow name. So now in the parameter, I have provided the workspace name and the data flow name, correct, which is the corresponding drop down. So in this case, would my pipeline get executed properly? And parallelly, the lakehouse table name is not required as of now. So let me delete this and let me execute now. And let me go ahead and delete this again. The default value. Not required table. So now what I did is I parameterized this with the workspace name and the data flow name. And here I'm triggering the data flow without the required parameter, meaning it does have a parameter, but that is not required. So can I trigger this data flow via data pipeline without passing the parameters? So in both the cases, would it get executed properly? Yes or no? Any thoughts? If something would fail, which one would fail? Would it be this one or would it be this one that would fail? Any guess? You all can say that the data flow Gen2 that I had parameterized failed. Whereas the data flow the other data flow is getting executed because the parameter is no longer required. Correct. But I can use that parameter and override it. That's optional. So hence, it's getting executed now. Let it get executed. Now this was successful and this was a failure. Correct. Let's check the error message. Refresh data flow failed with the status not found. It is stating that it is not able to find the corresponding data flow. Correct. Can you see here in the input parameter, meaning though in the front end, we have the workspace name and the data flow name. But when Microsoft is passing the values, it is passing as data flow ID and workspace ID. Are these the workspace ID and the data flow ID? No, correct. These are the workspace name and the data flow name. So in my corresponding tenant, it is trying to find this workspace ID, and there is no such ID. Let's take a look with respect to the one that is successful. Can you see? It passes in the form of the ID, workspace ID, and the data flow ID 437. 437. So rather than passing the name as the parameter value, I have to pass the corresponding workspace ID and the data flow ID. So it was which one? Data flow under Gen2 without, correct? It is this one. So this is the corresponding data flow ID. And it is this I need to pass here rather than the name in parameterization. So now this corresponding data flow would be triggered properly. Any queries? Yes or no?
So is this ID required for only in the case of data flow or
No, it's in general.
general?
Basically, like in case of team activity, correct? Every team in the display, it would, when I sign in, correct, it would provide me the corresponding team name and the team chat. But in the backend, what Microsoft is doing is it is getting the ID of that corresponding chat for that corresponding account within the tenant in the backend and gets the ID. So in case if you have to parameterize these aspects, you have to give the ID rather than, can you see now it's successful. We cannot have the hard coded names. Some can have the name aspect as well. So that you have to debug by checking how Microsoft is providing the input. So for every activity that you are thinking of parameterizing, first try executing it by hard coding the value, then execute it and then check the corresponding input. In case if your input value is matching to your hard coded value, it means it is taking it as is. But if the values are some GUID, it means it is getting the corresponding ID in the tenant and executing it. So in that case, you would need to pass the ID names as parameterization rather than the GUID, rather than the names as the parameterization. Now, with respect to copy data activity,
can we Nandan, the ID we are putting in manually, so can it be dynamic?
can it be dynamically?
Huh?
So there are two aspects, correct? You can create a config table, but there, unfortunately, in the config table, you have to manually input the data,
Yes.
correct? But there is another way. See, as I said, Microsoft has its own set of REST APIs, correct? There is a REST API to get the workspace details.
Yes.
What I can do is, I can have a web activity, and that is the part of our automation case at the end of the bootcamp, wherein I can still use the workspace name as the parameter, and via the workspace name get the workspace ID at the runtime, because most of the users might not be familiar with the ID concept, correct? For them, it might be just the name, correct? So in that case, what I can do is I can still have the workspace name as the parameter and ask the user to provide the workspace name only. And then via web activity, via Microsoft REST API, one of the REST API, I can pass the workspace as the name and get workspace ID as the output, and pass that ID as an input within my data flow parameterization here. If you all remember, we can connect multiple activities and pass the output of one activity as the input of another activity, correct? So that is how you can make it dynamic, but somewhere or the other, you have to provide something manually as the parameter. It can either be the name or the ID. Clear?
Yeah.
Now, in the copy activity also, you can see, correct? I have connections that I can parameterize, correct? Use dynamic content. So here, let me select the workspace name as my dynamic content. But if you all can see,
Yeah, it takes workspace ID.
it takes the workspace ID of the corresponding, but the connection types are limited, correct? Meaning, now, in case if you want to earlier, when I say limited, this is in earlier, the connections that could have been parameterized were limited only to this four, the cake, meaning the components that are present within the OneLake itself. Now, couple of months back, or recently, Microsoft has enabled parameterization of all types of connections, which includes AWS, etc. So now I can even parameterize my copy activity Azure SQL. I saw somewhere Azure SQL database. I can type Azure SQL database. Correct? And now here the connection that I need to provide. Can you see? Specify the connection ID. Every connection has its own ID that we had seen. Correct? Or in case if you do not know, correct? hard code the connection, execute it, and then go and check in the copy activity output input what is the corresponding connection ID. Correct. Here I have to provide the corresponding connection ID name. But because the connection ID contains the corresponding database name, unfortunately here, can you see? There is a drop down, correct? But I can add a dynamic content, that is the database name. Here, it's the database name itself that you have to provide, since it's an Azure component, correct? In Azure, database does not have an ID associated with that. Hence, as I said, depending upon the different scenarios, correct? Your parameterization value can either be a GUID value or can be a static name itself. So any queries?
No.
So in this case, I have to provide the connection ID, whereas here in the database, I have to provide the database name only as the parameterization aspect. And then with respect to the dynamic aspect, I can enter it manually, and in manually, I can add the dynamic aspect. So everything can be parameterized rather than hard coded. This is what we call as a metadata driven framework. Meaning, rather than creating hard coded versions of different copy activities, what I can do is I can pass the parameters as an array, iterate the same set of activities. For every iteration, I'll pass the different set of parameters, and it would follow the same way of copying the data from one location to another, rather than creating separate set of copy activities or separate set of pipelines. This is the benefit of parameterizations. Any queries? I'll take it as a no then. So this concludes data flow gen 2 and data pipeline and the data factory experience, except for something called as column profiling. Correct? We'll discuss the concept of column profiling in the next session in detail. What does column profiling help us with and other aspects? So now up till now we covered a low code, no code way of data movement and data transformations. Correct? Now, imagine that if I want to do a complex set of transformations, correct? How to get it done? So for that, there is something called as notebooks. Now, under notebook, there are multiple types of notebooks. Correct? Now, the corresponding notebook is a PySpark, is a Spark version of the notebook, meaning it uses Spark engine to execute my code. Then you have Python notebook for full-fledged Python execution itself. And then you have T-SQL Analytics notebook to execute the T-SQL queries. Correct? So we have different engine notebooks. So let's start with the T-SQL Analytics, since most of you all are familiar with T-SQL. Now, where is it that we execute our T-SQL statement? On the Fabric warehouse itself, correct? So it is asking me to add the warehouse on which I want to execute my T-SQL statement. So I'll select the, where do I have a sample? Okay, let me select the SQL Analytics endpoint if it is for the Lakehouse one, since it's also like a warehouse version itself. Now, let me execute select all from dbo dot one, two, three, ABC. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the T-SQL version of the notebook is for us to execute T. It provides us an interface to execute our T-SQL statements or to parameterize your T-SQL statements and get it executed via the data pipelines, etc. So this is what is the benefit one might ask, correct? When you already have stored procedures, correct? So I'll leave that question to you all, that, and we'll discuss in the next session. The question is, when I can already in the data pipeline, correct? In the data pipeline, when I can already have a lookup activity that can execute the queries on the corresponding lakehouse, etc., or the fabric warehouse, then why is there a need for me to execute or to leverage the T-SQL version of the notebook? Correct? So do give some thought behind that. Also, one thing that I forgot to state is, let's take a look with respect to this lookup activity only. Correct? Let me go to my lakehouse, and within my lakehouse, let me go ahead and create a view. Correct? Let me open the SQL Analytics endpoint for Lakehouse 1. This is one hack with respect to the data pipeline aspect, correct? So let me first check whether there are any views or not. Okay, there is already an existing view, correct? Let me try executing that view. Select all from dbo.view1, correct? From dbo. So now I'm able to execute any SQL query can be executed that is supported in the corresponding syntactical aspect of the corresponding warehouse can be executed. Correct. Now, in the lookup activity, lookup as the name suggests is used to look up the data in the corresponding aspect. Now I want to connect to my lakehouse. Correct. I want to connect to lakehouse 1. Now within lakehouse 1, it only provides me the list of tables or files that I want to look up to. Meaning, can you see here? I am not getting the option to query my view. So in case, if I want to query the view that is present in my lakehouse, the lakehouse connector is not providing me with that option. So how to do that? Any thoughts? At least you all can give some try and try to think across and be vocal. नहीं आता है तो बोलो नहीं, we do not know, right? But let's be interactive. So is there a way for me to execute or query the view of the lake house via any other method? The lake house
Using
connector does not provide me with that option. Correct?
so using parameter.
Sorry, by using?
Parameter.
Sir, parameter के लिए, if what is parameterization? Agar
Okay.
in case if you are able to hard code a value somewhere, that if the hard code version of that is executed, it means then you can use a parameter to make it dynamic. But यहाँ आप किधर hard
Yes.
code कर पा रहे हो मुझे बताओ for you to parameterize this? Understood the question here? If you are not able to execute it in a hard-coded version, then how can you expect it to get executed in the parameterized version? Think about other aspects. How were you able to access Lakehouse other than UIV?
Shortcut.
Shortcut be created on views? Shortcut can only be created on the tables. Correct. Views is
Yes.
views किधर बन रहे हैं हमारा? Where is the view getting created? The answer is in front of you all. Where is the view getting created?
SQL analytical endpoint.
How can you access a SQL analytic endpoint? What is a SQL analytic endpoint? Let me reframe my question. SQL analytics endpoint we could access via SSMS, correct?
Yes.
If I can access it via SSMS, it means it's like an Azure SQL database or a database in itself, correct? So I can create a connection via Azure SQL database or a database, because at the backend it's like a database itself, correct? So I'll select Azure SQL database as the connection, provide the SQL analytics endpoint server name, database name as LK1, I don't need any gateway. Authentication type, for now I'll use my organizational account and I'll connect. So now I can query the corresponding view, dbo.view1. Now in case if I preview the data, I'll be able to see the corresponding view output. So this is how the views and other objects that have been created within the SQL Analytics endpoint, though are not directly available via the Lakehouse connector, can be accessed via the Azure SQL Database connector. Because SQL Analytics endpoint, as the name suggests, is a SQL way of accessing your Lakehouse. Am I clear? So now, when I do have ways to query the data, SQL data from a data pipelines itself, what is the significance of having a T-SQL notebook? Give some thought behind this. And we'll discuss that in our next session. Now let me tweak the notebook. Correct. Now, once you change the default language, basically stops any active session that is created and reverts it to the original aspect. Now, since I have changed, see, under T-SQL, correct? The Copilot is disabled because I'm using my Fabric trial capacity, correct? Any notebooks can be scheduled independently, similar to how we can schedule the Dataflow Gen 2 as well, an independent aspect. But you can also trigger the notebook via the data pipeline aspect for event-based aspect or even for scheduled aspect. Now, if you see, when I am changing the notebook type, there are some additional features or properties that are becoming visible in the UI aspect. When I switch from T-SQL to Spark Engine. Now, let us do some aspects leveraging UI driven route. Meaning, first, let me add a lakehouse. This process, basically what I want to do is, I want to do some analysis. I want to read some data or write back data into a lakehouse. Correct? So here, I want to select a lakehouse. So I selected my lakehouse. Now what this process that I'm doing is called, it is called mounting your lakehouse to the corresponding notebook. It means that I'm physically mounting my lakehouse LK1 onto this notebook. So it means whatever query I execute, it would be executed on this lakehouse itself. Does it mean that I always have to hard code or I have to manually come and mount this lakehouse? No, you can write a code wherein whatever process I did manually, I can do it at runtime. So in that case, since it can be done at runtime, I can parameterize the lakehouse that I want to mount it. The advanced concept of parameterization we will take a look subsequently. But for now, let's proceed with the manual version. So for now, I manually mounted my lakehouse to the corresponding notebook. Now under that, under my file section, under structured, I have a CSV file. Now I want to read this CSV file, correct? Or I want to load the data. Now since basically in Python, there is so there are two aspects. In Python, there is a concept called pandas, and then there is something called as PySpark version, correct? In this aspect, we will be taking a look with respect to the PySpark version. So now let me go ahead and delete this. So just a click of this give me the corresponding code that I want. So what it is stating here that use the Spark version to read a file of format CSV which contains a header, and this is the path of that corresponding file, and this I am preserving within the data frame. Data frame one can consider as a temp table. Those who are familiar with SQL, correct? Temp table is wherein you are temporarily preserving all your data in a corresponding instance. So data frame can be considered as a temp table equivalent. And then I'm displaying that corresponding data. And now I'm executing this. So what this is doing is, it is reading the data of this file path with header as true. Now, since I have set the format as CSV, correct? So it was assuming comma separated, but there is no comma separated values. Hence, it provided me with only one column. So if that is the case, how to add additional delimitation, how to parameterize this, etc., we'll take a look in the subsequent session. For now, let's understand how the different basic aspects of the notebook. So now, the default language that is selected within the Spark engine is the PySpark Python. Hence, here I can see that it is PySpark Python. Now, let me read the same data, load the same data via pandas. So here, it's written something called as import pandas as PD. What does this mean? Basically, pandas is a Python library or a Python package. Similar to how in PowerShell, in PowerShell, you have libraries or a PowerShell gallery, correct? Wherein this contains some unique packages, correct? If you remember, for me to create the case insensitive warehouse, I had to first install some modules and import certain modules, and one of the module was AZ account. Similarly, Python has its own set of packages or libraries one can consider. And Python is Pandas is one such aspect. Hence, what I'm doing is I'm trying to import the Panda into my corresponding session. And then, because it's the Pandas framework that I'm using here. So first I have to import it. And then it has its own set of syntax. So to create a Pandas data frame, PD, meaning I am using that module, dot read CSV, read underscore CSV is an inbuilt functionality wherein I have to provide the path and it would execute the corresponding command. So you have a PySpark version and a Pandas version on how you can execute it. Now imagine that I want to add another code here. You can add a separate code cell. So this separate aspect that you are seeing here are what we call as cells. Every cell can have its own version of the code, but this flows in a sequential manner, meaning when I click on run, meaning I can individually execute these cells for debugging purposes. And once all my debugging is done, then I can execute something called as run all. What this does is it runs all these cells, but in a sequential manner. Now the aspect with this is, up till now here you can see that every time I have used a PySpark Python version only. Does it mean that within a notebook all these cells need to have the same language? No, you can change. Rather than PySpark Python, I can use Spark SQL. Correct. And I can write select all from one, two, three, four, A, B, C. So this % is what we call as magic command. And this is common across Databricks or Synapse notebooks or Fabric notebooks, etc. Correct? So what this magic command does is it converts the language of the corresponding cell to the required type. So either I can manually select the drop down here, or I can explicitly add the % command. So now let me add a new code. Can you see here PySpark Python? Correct. Now let me add % SQL. It automatically converted into Spark SQL. If I want Spark Scala, it is % Spark, HTML, and R script. So either you can explicitly select the drop down to change your language within the cell, or you can use the magic command. This is with respect to the base of notebooks. But up till now, the cells that we created were only for executing your code. But imagine that if I want to create parameters, correct? How can I create the parameters? How to do the dynamic aspect? how to do some data transformations, etc. Those we would cover in detail in the next session. So team